if we finish early, you can ask more questions. We'll say other things, okay? But let's get started. So I want to begin by sort of saying a little bit, by just by way of introduction, sort of why I wanted to sort of address this topic. And the truth is that it's one reason is I bought Rabbi Shalom's book a couple of years ago, and I've been looking for an excuse to read it and study it and teach about it. So that's often why I teach things, because I'm interested and curious about a topic, and I want to research in some way. And this is how that, so that's the secret. Okay, now you know. The other reason is that in the summer, as we were thinking in really new ways about issues of racial justice, the question of the integration of Ethiopian Jewry into the global Jewish community, I think, is one interesting facet on some of these broader questions. This is a racially distinct group of Jews with a very distinct history and also a very distinct way of practicing Judaism. And those who've studied the community since their Aliyah, they've faced a lot of challenges that are not dissimilar from challenges faced by other racial minorities. And there's all sorts of issues about job discrimination, education discrimination, housing discrimination, police brutality, all of the same issues that confront us here. They also exist in Israel, and there's every so often it pops into the news, and sometimes in a very dramatic way, sometimes with mass protests and that's been a feature of Israeli life for the past generations or so, that the Ethiopian community has been living there. And yet still there's also, and there's the layer of how that how that integrates into the world of the Beit Midrash as well. That's sort of really what I wanted to try to focus on. There are many other, if this topic interests you, there are many other speakers and other resources for further study about sort of the social dynamics of the Ethiopian community in Israel and the challenges they face and the achievements they've earned. But for now, I want to really kind of pivot to, within the world of the Beit Midrash, how is this community, what's one attempt of this community being integrated into the world of the Beit Midrash. Okay, so that's the pivot. So just a brief overview of the history. There are lots of legends, the origin of this community is shrouded in mystery. A lot of legends. Some legends say that the community was established by the descendants of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. Right, Tanakh says that they married, and they went back to someplace in Africa where she was Sheba, I guess, and these are their offspring. And so this would be if that story one accepts it as true, then this is a very, very ancient community that was established in biblical times, in early biblical times, right? In the earliest mists of biblical history, the time of the generation of Solomon. So that would be a very, very old origin of the community. There are others who speak of the community as being descendants of the 10 lost tribes, particularly the tribe of Dan, which would say the community had its origin in 722 BCE, which is several hundred years after Solomon, but still quite ancient. Okay, when Sennacherib and the Assyrians came and destroyed the kingdom of Israel, and dispersed the Israelites to wherever they went. So maybe some of them ended up in Ethiopia. There are all over the world. There are people who claim or ascribe their origins to the 10 lost tribes. This was a major piece in American history. There were lots of folks who thought that the Native Americans were descendants of the 10 lost tribes. That's a core component of Mormonism, that belief. But it was not just Mormons who thought this was a common assumption in early American life, and all over the world. Again, there are people who claim that is their origin, not with necessarily any independent historical confirmation. There are other historians who say the Ethiopian Jewish community, they're descendants of Egyptian Jews who moved south to Ethiopia between the 7th century BC and the 2nd century CE. So in ancient times, there was a massive, massive Jewish community in Egypt in Second Temple times and into post Second Temple times. We Alexandria in Egypt had hundreds of thousands of Jews according to some contemporary accounts. It was a massive, massive Jewish community, and that community did not endure, and some of them may have traveled south. So that's one source as well of the possible origins of this community. That would be dated from the 7th century BCE to the 2nd century CE. Others say this is a community that migrated to Ethiopia from Yemen between the 2nd and 6th century of the Common Era. So that's that's another another source idea, and I lost my okay, and others say it was that they emerged indigenously, like they didn't migrate from anywhere. There were Coptic Christians in Ethiopia, and sometime in the 14th to 16th century, um, uh, they became Jewish. They identified themselves as Jewish. The the Ethiopian church is one of the earliest Christian communities. The Ethiopians became Christian in the 4th century, so it was one of the first places on earth to become Christian was Ethiopia. Right, it was like shortly after Constantine, the Ethiopian emperor, became Christian. So it's a very, very ancient Christian community. That's why they have their corner of the Church of the Sepulchre in Jerusalem. They were very, very, very ancient church, and so they were Christian for a very long time. And we know this from American history. If you have Christians, every so often, some of them like read the Bible and decide they should be Jewish. Right, that is something that does happen to Christians. Like if you like every 100 years, some percentage of Christians will decide that they should be Jewish. It happens in America spontaneously from time to time, and maybe it happened in Ethiopia. That could also be the origins of this community. I'm going to reshare the outline, just so I realize some of you have joined since I shared it, and you can't see it. There it is again in the chat. In the 9th century, there was a fellow named Eldad Hadani, right? Who was his name was Eldad, okay? I'll share his Wikipedia page just so he was like, he was an interesting figure. Eldad Hadani, he claimed to be from the tribe of Dan, claimed to be from an independent Jewish kingdom in East Africa, had a wild story of piracy and captivity and adventure, and he traveled to the Jewish communities of North Africa and the Middle East in the 9th century and told amazing stories of the 10 lost tribes and independent Jewish kingdoms living far beyond the mountains, beyond the sea. And some of the greatest rabbinic minds who encountered him, like investigated him, and they said his story seems true, and this seeded a lot of like the imagination of Jewish communities for hundreds of years that there were Jews that we didn't know about, otherwise entirely cut off, living far away, etc. And so that also is like sort of helped plant the seeds for the ultimate acceptance of the idea there were Jews living in Africa. There were Jewish kingdoms in Africa that otherwise unknown about. So Tzemach Gaon, who wrote in the 10th century, accepted his testimony as valid, said Eldad is indeed an Israelite from the tribe of Dan, and he comes bringing messages from this broader community. He was actually his writings were very influential for like Jewish linguists, because he spoke Hebrew in a way that no one else did. Like it seems that he claimed to come from a place where Hebrew was a spoken language, and he seemed to have like the ability to do so in ways that was like really amazing, impressive to the Jews of the early Middle Ages. In the 16th century, the Rabbi, who was a great posek in Egypt, encountered Ethiopian Jews and spoke to them, investigated them, and said that they were Jews. They were valid Jews. They were not Karaites. So let's sort of take a step back. The Karaites were I guess from our perspective, a heretical Jewish sect that emerged in late antiquity, the early Middle Ages, and they reject rabbinic tradition, and they try to reformulate Judaism as a religion based on the Torah alone, on scripture alone, without a mikra, okay, that's hence the name, without any of the rabbinic interpretation, rabbinic traditions. And so this was a major challenge to we call mainstream rabbinic Judaism, to defend our way of life and our Talmud-centered, rabbinic tradition-centered way of life against the claims of the Karaites that no, to be an authentic Jew is just to follow the words of Scripture alone. They were kind of like biblical fundamentalists. I don't know. There was an they still exist. They have a website, they have a newsletter. You can find them. Okay, they exist, and they still make these claims about how to be, to be true to the Torah is to reject any human interpretations that deviate from the plain sense meaning of the Torah. And a lot of the greatest scholars of the Middle Ages encountered them and contended with them and argued against them. And so these Ethiopian Jews that the Radbaz encountered had no notion of rabbinic tradition. Either they moved to Ethiopia in the time of Solomon, before like very early in Jewish history, before rabbinic tradition had a chance to emerge, or they went there from Egypt, the Egyptian Jewish community in the Second Temple period before the emergence of rabbinic Judaism, or maybe they were Coptic Christians who decided they were Jewish, and they sort of constructed their Judaism based on the Bible, and so they had no concept. So they don't know anything that's post-biblical is not part of their religious practice. Their religion is really based on their traditions of how to read the Hebrew Bible. That sounds kind of like Karaites, which means they should be heretics and excluded from Jewish communal life. And Rabbi says, no, they're not heretics, they're not Karaites, because they don't know any better. And if you teach them, like, here's how Jews have understood these verses in the Torah, and this is how we practice, they're very receptive to that message. And so then they shouldn't be condemned as Karaites. And so that's also very important. So even though their practice outwardly seems to be comparable to how the Karaites practice, and the Rabbis knew Karaites, they were a big Karaite presence in Egypt. He said that the Ethiopian Jews whom he met were not Karaites. It shouldn't be considered as Karaites, and that ends up being quite important. They have a synagogue in the U.S. in Daly City, California. Cool. Have you been there? Or no? Okay. Yeah, I met some Karaites once. I went to like a big the GA, the Federation has this annual conference and there was the Karaites had a booth. They were handing out propaganda. So that was the Karaite. My grandmother traveled to Egypt years and decades ago, and she met some Karaites there. There's a Karaite synagogue. There was, I don't know, it's still there. There was a Karaite synagogue in Egypt. My grandmother visited. It was interesting. They were the Nazis didn't persecute them. It was very interesting, I think, and by and large. So they're sort of there. Even though like ethnically, racially, they're Jewish in their origin, they had been so distinct from the Jewish community for so long that they escaped persecution in the Nazi period, which I think was obviously a fraught dynamic. Okay, let's continue on that story. 1862, Abba Mahari, an Ethiopian Jewish leader, the first Zionist, he led a delegation of Ethiopian Jews to Jerusalem. He got up one day, decided it's time to go to Jerusalem, and it was not successful. Many died on the trip. They returned home to Ethiopia, but that again sort of speaks to this community's religious passion and devotion to make their way to Eretz Yisrael. And we have they're mentioned by a number of 19th and 20th century rabbis, wrote about them, advocated for them. And really it was the introduction, it was the Protestant missionary activity in Ethiopia brought this community to the attention of the global Jewish community, because the missionaries brought back reports of these tribes in East Africa practicing Judaism. And so that's how the European Jewish community heard about them. And Rabbi Tzvi Kalisher, very important proto-Zionist, and the Malbim in Eastern Europe, and Rav Kook, all wrote with great passion and sympathy on behalf of Ethiopian Jewry. And when the state of Israel was established, starting in the 50s already, the Mossad and the foreign ministry started making openings, advances to the Ethiopian government and to the Ethiopian Jewish community to try to encourage or see if Aliyah could happen. The halachic decision that paved the way was Rav Ovadia Yosef. Ovadia Yosef, who at the time was the Sephardic chief rabbi of Israel, one of the greatest, most significant rabbinic sages of the 20th century. If there are Jews 1,000 years from now, they'll be reading Rav Ovadia's Torah, I believe. And he said they were Jewish. Based on the Rabbis who said they were Jewish, and based on these traditions of Eldad Hadani, and he said they were Jewish, and that paved the way and the Knesset then accepted that and paved the way for them to fall under the rubric of the Chok HaShvut, the law of return, that they could be eligible for Israeli citizenship instantly, like other Olim from other Jewish diaspora communities. And there were several waves of Aliyah that took place starting in the 1980s. In 1980, whatever, here 1984 through 1991, that's when the bulk of the community came, but there were some remnants that came only more recently. Maybe some are still there. I think the last groups really didn't. There were some segments of the Ethiopian Jewish community that had converted to Christianity in the 19th century and early 20th centuries, and they were a little bit. They were they were at the back of the line for coming to an Aliyah. I have a link. If you're looking on the outline, there's a link here to Rabbi Sharon sort of describing his story and where he came from and his Aliyah experience and the trauma and of his relocation to Israel. He writes that not in this autobiography, so it's worth reading at some point. So had that link, take a look at it at some point. He describes the experience of the Ethiopian Jewish community coming to Israel as akin to the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, which is sort of ironic, right? The destruction of the temple was a national trauma, of course, right? And many died. And we had to entirely rethink what it meant to be Jewish, right? Because we didn't have the Beit HaMikdash, didn't have the sacrifices in the Beit HaMikdash. We had to reconstruct Jewish life in the absence of the Beit HaMikdash. And for the Ethiopian Jews who had been yearning for hundreds of years to move to Israel, to see Jerusalem, once they finally got to Jerusalem and all the challenges and realizing that their way of practicing Judaism was totally different from everyone else, they also had to entirely reconstruct their Jewish life and what it meant to be Jewish in light of all of these developments that we've been going through for 2,000 years that they'd not been a part of. Some of them didn't know the temple had been destroyed. So that's also part of what's motivating his book. He was a person who's a representative of a community that was torn asunder with its encounter with modernity and its encounter with rabbinic Judaism, right? All at the same time. That their dreams of the temple, right? That it's like discovering the temple. To just discover the temple, it's what an amazing. Like, can you imagine you're a Jew, like yearning to go to Jerusalem, where you think the temple exists, and then you discover that it actually was destroyed for thousands of years ago. It's like the trauma is fresh, was fresh for them, with all the other traumas of relocation and poverty and et cetera, right? Charles, I see I see your question, and I'm not ignoring it. I'm just delaying answering it. Okay. Yeah. So Rabbi Shalom ended up in Yeshivat Har Tzion, which is where I studied. He was there before I was. Not he didn't overlap with me there, but he overlapped with me. He's like a few years older than I am, but not that much older than I am. So we have like the people I know were in yeshiva with him, and he describes a feeling of So one other element that I sort of should share also. Rav Ovadia Yosef's decision that they were Jewish paved the way for their aliyah, but it was not the only opinion. There were some who said that they really were not Jewish, and certainly historians cast some doubt on their claims to be descendants of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, and the way that the way that ended up being sort of reconciled was that they came in aliyah and they all underwent a pro forma conversion ceremony upon arrival in Israel. The entire community, 30,000 people, all were brought to a mikveh and sort of had a conversion ceremony upon their arrival in Israel, which, needless to say, was traumatic, right? As if you know from yourself or from a friend, like the conversion process is very personal. It's very intense process, and to do it as part of a cog in a bureaucratic immigration absorption process was traumatic and was offensive to the community as well. What do you mean? Like we walked for 1,000 miles across the desert, burying our relatives along the way to stay in refugee camps for 6 months until coming to Israel, and you're telling us we're not Jewish until we convert. So it was offensive as well. So Rabbi Shalom early in the book describes an encounter with his Rosh Yeshiva, my Rosh Yeshiva Wolkenfeld and Rabbi tells it so, and he asked them each, like, why did you do this? Why did you make us convert? And the answer that they received from both of them in somewhat different ways, he describes it as a difficult conversation, but ultimately a healing one, was we wanted to make sure there'd be no barriers within our Beit Midrash. That if anybody in the world, any Jewish person who wants to marry you, that and comes to me for a recommendation, I would recommend it wholeheartedly. And in order to integrate you as into our Beit Midrash, into our community, we insist on this conversion practice because of the doubts and the mysteries of the origins of the Ethiopian Jewish community. And that was a helpful thing for Rabbi Shalom to hear. That he writes in the introduction to the book that it's a hard message, but it was delivered with a lot of compassion. And he sort of understood the motivation for this trauma his community went through, that it was not out of disrespect, but out of a desire to integrate and to make sure there would be no barriers among Jews after this process. He then describes for his own, he's studying in yeshiva, he's studying for rabbinic ordination, and he felt he had to choose, my Sephardi or my Ashkenazi, right? You study typical halachic works. You read the Shulchan Aruch, which is the Sephardic tradition, and you read the Ramah, which is the Ashkenazi tradition, and and the Shach and the Taz, and that's what he's doing in yeshiva. And he's like, well, what am I? Which practices should I adopt, the Sephardic tradition or the Ashkenazi tradition? And I don't know. And he spoke to he spoke to Rav Brandis, who was another teacher whom I've met over the years and I've spoken about over the years. At the time, he was at Beit Marashah. Sarah was a student at Beit Marashah when I was at the Gush, so she was the one who introduced me to Rav Brandis. Rav Brandis told Rabbi Shalom, you don't actually have to choose to be Ashkenazi or Sephardi because you're neither, actually. There's no reason why you have to pick one. And that was also really, really helpful for him, sort of as he's describing his spiritual autobiography, his path as a thinker of halacha. And then he spoke to Rabbi Dr. Daniel Sperber, who is a rabbi at choose rice. Yeah, well, a month of slichot, not so easy. Everyone wants rice. Not everyone wants to get up for a month of slichot. Although Sephardi slichot are fun. That's what they Rabbi Sperber said, not only do you not have to choose between being Ashkenazi or Sephardi, you don't have to accept the authority of the Shulchan Aruch as like the final and its commentaries as the final codification of Jewish practice. The red lines is the Talmud. Rabbi Sperber said the Talmud, the Babylonian Talmud, was the last book accepted by almost every Jewish community. That's the red line. And if religious practice can be justified by the Talmud, it doesn't, that's your red line. And within those very broad parameters, you can kind of embrace your Ethiopian heritage. And so what most of the book from Sinai to Ethiopia is going through all of the, large number of areas of Jewish law and practice, describing how this mode of Jewish life was practiced in Ethiopia, giving a summary of the Talmudic traditions around that issue, and then offering his suggestion for how Ethiopian Jews should practice. Okay, so and I've sort of sorted it out in like three major categories. Somewhere he says the Ethiopian practice should be maintained, and if you're an Ethiopian Jew, you can practice with pride the traditions of your ancestors because it doesn't deviate from the Talmud, and this is the way that your ancestors practiced Judaism. And then he has a few other cases where he says, no, really the Talmud is better, and the Talmud strongly rejects Ethiopian practice and the Talmud, and we should therefore defer to the Talmud. And he has a third series of laws where he says someone in between. We'll see some examples and see what he says. I was in touch with someone today, an anthropologist who studied the Ethiopian Jewish community. His name is Don Seaman. Sorry, it's the book in English. Somebody asked me, is this book in English? This book that I have is in Hebrew. The book has been translated into English, actually, which I did not know until a few days ago. Okay, so the book does exist in English. If you find this interesting and you want to follow up, From Sinai to Ethiopia is available at Amazon and wherever books are sold, and you can read it in English. Okay, so go for it. So Don Seaman is an anthropologist whose early research was in the Ethiopian Jewish community. And I asked him about the reception of this book. And he said it's in many, many Ethiopian homes. It's a very widely read book. He also said that there are non-Ethiopians who turn to him for questions because of how flexible he is. In other words, this practice of kind of going back to the Talmud and what are the red lines and what are the range of possibilities is it's a very compelling approach to some people. And they're non-Ethiopians who've turned to him for guidance. And he actually serves as a rabbi of a congregation that is not Ethiopian. It's an Ashkenazi congregation. He's actually learned to speak Yiddish. Because he serves in Ashkenazi, a lot of Holocaust survivors. He speaks Yiddish with his balabatim, and that's who he's with. That's who he's davening with every day. And so that's sort of how his career has evolved. He was featured on an Israeli TV show maybe a year or two ago, and it was fun to see clips of him, like any other rabbi, who has talking to his balabatim, his members of his community, who are Ashkenazi, Jews, Yiddish-speaking Jews, many of them. Okay, so the question that Charles asked. The Oral Torah is from Sinai, so wouldn't they have known the Oral Torah? Or maybe only rabbinic enactments after the Second Temple. So I would say two things. So first of all, much of the Oral Torah is Gzeirot, right? Actual pieces of rabbinic legislation that emerged later in history from when this community split off. So that certainly they wouldn't have known about that. That includes things like Purim and Hanukkah, okay, and the laws of Muktzah, okay. All of these are like mitzvot or Rabbanan. These are rabbinic enactments that, like came at some point. The other answer to your question is that even though when we say the oral Torah is also from Sinai, there are, let's say, different ways of understanding that. And I'm going to, for sake of gross simplicity, I'm going to say there are two ways of understanding that. One way of understanding that is there was a comprehensive revelation of the oral Torah at Sinai, meaning the content of the oral Torah also was given over at Sinai, in which case, why didn't these 10 lost tribes know about it? I don't know, maybe it wasn't why they didn't have schools back then, and it was only known to a few people, and there were a lot of competing ideologies. And we know, I mean, in the time of the first temple period, we were worshiping a lot of idols, so we probably weren't so careful about, widespread Torah knowledge, right? The other approach to what we mean when we say that the oral Torah is also from Sinai, it's that means that God gave Moshe the Torah, the Chumash, and said, and I want you to interpret this. So the hermeneutical principles by which the Torah is expounded, or just the charge and the authorization to go do oral Torah, like, do Midrash, figure out what this means legally, like that. So the Torah says you observe Shavuot to count 7 weeks, mimacharat HaShabbat, the day after Shabbat. So does that mean you start counting on Sunday, the first Sunday after Pesach, and Shavuot is 7 weeks after on a Sunday? Or does that mean, no, Shabbat in that verse really means Yantif, okay? It means Pesach, and so it's 7 weeks after Pesach. So we believe Shabbat in that verse means Pesach, it means Yantif, and Shavuot is 7 weeks after Pesach, whatever day of the week that would be. There are many, and we know from the ancient world, we know from Christian communities, we know from Sadducees and Karaites that they think that Shavuot is always on a Sunday, that you start counting on the Sunday. So if you think that there was a comprehensive revelation of the oral Torah, then we were given that information at Sinai, or maybe we were just told, no, here's the Torah, figure out what it means. And we engaged in Midrash, and we had arguments, and we figured it out, and we decided that it means that Shavuot is on the same day of the week as Pesach, that Macharat Shabbat means the day after Yantif. And that's also from Sinai because God wanted us to do that. And that's a biblical mitzvah. Celebrating Shavuot is a biblical mitzvah. We celebrate on the date that rabbis determined the Torah wants us to celebrate the day, the holiday. So they may not have known that because they were already out of the picture when those deliberations, those discoveries made. We discovered the meaning of the Torah. If you want to read, there's a book called How Do We Know This? By Jay Harris. I recommend it wholeheartedly. It's a history of theories of Midrash Halacha. Okay, like it's an intellectual history of different arguments and theories and debates about the origins of the oral Torah. Okay, so that was a digression, but very important. Okay, this is how we know this. Okay, how we practice where it comes from. Okay, let's go. I'm going to share some examples with you in the remaining time, and again, encourage you. You can read the book in Hebrew, you can read the book in English. It's filled with examples. So the first example, the umbrella. Okay, why don't we use umbrellas on Shabbat? Anyone want to give us a executive summary why we don't use umbrellas on Shabbat? You can unmute yourself and share. What's the concern?
It's pitching a tent.
Yeah, it's pitching a tent. So what if the umbrella is already open before Shabbat?
Carrying,
no? That would be carrying if there's no Eruv.
Hey, let's say there's an Eruv.
Marasai.
Yeah, it looks like you open the umbrella before Shabbat. Right? Who keeps open umbrellas lying around? It takes a lot of room. So you walk around with an umbrella, everyone will think that you opened it on Shabbat. Opening the umbrella is building a tent. Now, how is that different from putting the canopy over the stroller when the baby doesn't get wet? If it starts raining on Shabbos or it's a sunny day, you're gonna put the canopy over the stroller. The answer is it's not different at all. But why do we open baby stroller canopies and not umbrellas? Because when umbrellas were invented, some rabbis said they're forbidden, some rabbis said they're permissible. The arguments that say it's permissible are actually quite compelling. In deference to those who say it's forbidden, we don't use umbrellas on Shabbat. In Ethiopia, they use umbrellas on Shabbat. In fact, you maybe see pictures, you can find pictures they have of, it's like part of your ceremonial, beautiful, like Shabbat clothing is to have an ornamental, beautiful umbrella. You can definitely find pictures. So what does he recommend? So he recommends that, he said, Yehudei Ethiopia Rishayim Shemesh b'mitriya b'Shabbat. So Ethiopian Jews, they can use umbrellas on Shabbat. This is their ancient tradition. They don't have to defer to, Chassam Sofer, whoever it was. Chassam Sofer? The Note of Yehuda who says umbrellas are forbidden. And he says, "V'nir sheyesh latzir lehem lo rak bilechtam lebeit knesset elegam letzorech hagana v'nei geshem b'tanai shivtachu oto l'fnei knisat Shabbat." Not only as part of the way to look grand and elegant and ceremonious when walking to synagogue, but also to protect yourself against the rain. You can also use an umbrella as well, just for rain protection, which is, common use of umbrellas. As long as you open it before Shabbat. You can't open it, it doesn't go so far so you can open, but if you open it before Shabbat, you can use it. And he says, there's no concept of married ayin for Ethiopian Jews. This is a very, very pious community that loves God and loves the Torah and its mitzvot, and we're not concerned about things that don't look from. So we can use umbrellas and Shabbat. So that's a full-throated endorsement of Ethiopian Jewish practice, even in conflict with. It's not in conflict with the Talmud. It's in conflict with the Achronim, with the Noda B'Yehuda, who says don't use umbrellas. It's in conflict with established Jewish custom amongst Shomer Shabbos communities not to use umbrellas. But we're also, he says, the Ethiopian community, we're also a observant Jewish community that has been observing Shabbat for hundreds of years under great difficulty, and we use umbrellas. We're going to continue to use umbrellas. Okay, that's an example of his championing Ethiopian practice. Next example, okay, where does he say that, where he defers to rabbinic tradition? This is the case of Pikuach Nefesh. Okay, Pikuach Nefesh. What's Pikuach Nefesh? Pikuach Nefesh is when life is in danger, we violate Shabbat, right? Is that obvious from the Torah that we violate Shabbat when life is in danger? Sorry, that's when I asked this question. Vincent said yes. That is a general principle for him. He thinks Ethiopian religious mentality is one that doesn't lend itself to chashash. He claims this is a typology in the Babylonian Talmud and the Palestinian Talmud. Babylonian Talmud is more concerned with chashash and the lest you do something and fear of sin, and the Palestinian Talmud is more inspired by the opportunity to do mitzvot, and he sees it as like typologies. A little forced maybe, but that's sort of a religious typology that he develops, and he says the Ethiopian Jewish community is more aligned with the Palestinian Talmudic tradition of not being so concerned and fearful about the potential for sin. And so he says a number of cases. We're not worried, we're a pious community. We don't have to be so concerned for such things. Pikuach Nefesh is a case where the Ethiopian community doesn't have this never developed this notion that we violate Shabbat when life is in danger. In fact, the Ethiopian community, part of their scriptures was a translation of the Book of Jubilees, which has very, very strict Shabbat restrictions. Jubilees is not part of our Tanakh. It's it's in a part of the Apocrypha. So it was an ancient book written by Jews that didn't make it into our scripture, but was treated as scripture by some Jewish communities. It made its way to the Ethiopian Jewish community, and it was part of their scriptural heritage. And based on its very, very strict Shabbat restrictions, they don't have they don't have this idea of Pikuach Nefesh. When life was in danger, it overrides Shabbat. And he told us, right to the book, he had a story of his grandfather told a story of two Ethiopian women who were sleeping out in a tent. In the Ethiopian tradition is that women in Nida sleep outside the home in a special Nida tent, which is also a Babylonian tradition in ancient times. And they were worried. There were lions and they were really scared, but they did it. And there was a non-Jewish woman who went also with them in the tent, and she slept in between the two Jewish women because she was scared of the lions, and the lion ate her. Okay. And because if you, his grandfather said, if you're a faithful Jew, God will protect you. What God wants is you to do the mitzvot, and we don't deviate from the mitzvot. So that's obviously not our halakhic tradition. Our halakhic tradition is that in most cases, we push mitzvot aside when life is in danger. And he just says, yeah, okay, and that's a discovery of the Talmud, or that's a position of the Talmud. And he says, yeah, you should this should he says Chal Isur Muchlat Linhog Kafi Shaya Nahug Ethiopia. It's an outright prohibition to practice according to Ethiopian halacha and put life in danger. So that's a case, you can understand why he feels that the Ethiopian heritage should be entirely subdued in favor of this universal ethical principle or halakhic principle that life overrides Shabbat. And a similar case, the Ethiopian tradition was that kids begin to fast on Yom Kippur at age 7. And he says that also is, he pushes that aside as well. He thinks that they should wait, that's just not safe. It's not a good idea. And he pushes that aside as well. Linda, you asked about what about marriage? How is it? Yeah, so I think he I think he definitely encouraged. There's a lot of intermarriage, or a fair amount of intermarriage among the various communities in Israel, and he feels that a melding of halachic traditions is possible as well, also with the Ethiopian traditions as well. And so I think he's in favor of that. You'll see this last case example though maybe is a good sort of middle ground which also can maybe help suggest what he would say for families where people come from different backgrounds. This is the case of money in shul. In Ethiopia, people bring money to shul or to the synagogue on Shabbat to donate it to the shul. Okay, and so not like cat, not an auction like what we do, like with the Ashkenazi tradition of an auction in shul, but an actual like they bring cash and they throw it in the basket, whatever. It's like a donation, and they think this is part of their right. What says in the Torah, right? It says, "V'lo yired pnei Hashem rekam, ish kamat not yodok Hashem elokecha asher tzamach." You don't show when you show up, before God, you don't come empty-handed. You bring a gift. God's blessed you. You give some back. Ava says, yeah, like in churches where they pass the basket around. I don't know if they pass a basket around Ethiopian synagogues. Maybe I think it might be a central place where they throw money. I think is what here it says. Yeah, they bring coins. Okay, they bring coins. So what's the problem with that in our Talmudic heritage? Because it's muktzah. Okay, money is muktzah. It's not a biblical prohibition. It's a rabbinic prohibition. It's a muktzah prohibition. Okay, muktzah is a series of restrictions that were adopted to make Shabbat more different from the weekday, out of a concern that Shabbat would be too similar to the weekday, and out of a concern lest you use these items in forbidden ways. So don't move certain things, don't have any interaction with certain things, lest you use them inappropriately. And this is like a source of real tension, because you can imagine. Could you imagine what it would be like? You go to shul, and people are bringing money, and they're like, it actually, I don't have to imagine. It happened. There was a older Russian gentleman who comes to our synagogue on Yom Kippur, and he brings cash to donate to the shul, which is a very generous offer, but it's always very it's always very awkward. He like gives me this envelope of cash he's collected from his friends, and it's like I don't want to touch it. So it does happen. But if you imagine that, so in there's a synagogue in Kiryat Gat, I believe, where people bring money and people say terrible things. They say it's like not a synagogue. Like they say people speak very disparagingly, and you can imagine this also could lead to tension between generations. That again, the grandparents who walked 1,000 miles on foot to reach the land of Israel, and they're showing their devotion to God by bringing their money to the synagogue to give it to God, and then the kids who go to the local Dati Mamlechti school and are told, you can't touch money on Shabbat, and they tell that, like all the tensions, right? I mean, it's like which can happen to any, not unfamiliar to what can happen in our families as well when a kid goes to yeshiva and learns that his parents are doing things a little differently than what they're taught in school. But this is perhaps even more dramatically so because of how much the parents suffered and because of how anathema it is to, like many of us, to handle cash or coins on Shabbat. So he says, I'll read the paragraph. Many places in Israel, in the synagogues that are filled with Ethiopian immigrants, the custom endures to bring a cash donation to the synagogue on Shabbat. And somebody who that's his custom, you continue to do so. So he endorses this practice for those who already have. They continue to bring cash to shul on Shabbat. Okay, so it's not muktzah because it has a Shabbat use. Okay, it's like using your screwdriver to open up your nuts. Okay, it's a Shabbat use. It's not muktzah because you have a Shabbat use. What's the Shabbat use? I'm donating it to the synagogue on Shabbat. Be'olam Ethiopia habanui al amun ein chosheshim shema dehu yelech b'yom haShabbat yishtamesh b'kesev l'rimachrim. There's no in the Ethiopian religious is your question of Vincent, right? Oh no, it was whose connection? Somebody's question about whatever, right? If in the Ethiopian religious perspective built on faith and faith in human potential, right? So there's no concern that somebody's going to take that money and go to the store and buy something. Hadam harei rotzeh le'avodah hakadosh baruch hu. Misha ein rotzeh lo'ba le'beit knesset. People want to serve God. Somebody doesn't want to serve God, he's not going to go to shul. Okay? The fact that he's in shul means that he wants to serve God. He's going to use his money to donate to the synagogue. He's not going to use it to buy something. Chashash hi mila zara ba'olamam. Chashash, lest you, a concern, what's going to happen? Like doesn't exist in Ethiopian concern. Okay, Jubilees, other second divisions are very strict at what we call muktzah. I would expect Ethiopians to be more miyachmir about it. No, so they are Jubilees treats many things that we would consider as drabanans and stuff like that as dioraita. I think the way they would say, money per se, I don't know, I think is in Jubilees. I think even if it is though, they're doing their own, the Torah says you pure for God and you give gifts. Jubilee says don't, so they reconcile and you bring gifts to, whatever it is, whatever implicit Midrash, halakha they've worked out is in favor of bringing money to the synagogue on Shabbat. I don't think they're lenient about other. I don't think the concept of it's right. Yeah. So the paragraph on Muktzah, he says, "Hamusag Muktzah lo haya mukar lihudei Ethiopia l'maaseh hem lo tiltulu Muktzah sharei hem nishmeru mikol melecha b'Shabbat im zeh l'tzorech avodat ha'el hutar l'tatel kol davar." So that's their Muktzah practice, right? So they're very strict about not doing melacha on Shabbat, and that just by being strict about not working and doing forbidden labors on Shabbat, they are going to tend not to handle scissors and needles and sewing machines, but for serving God, they believe that that they do. So in that sense, they are lenient. So I found this fascinating. And is he accepted? Is he not accepted? I think there's a pushback against him from more conservative, more Orthodox, like pro-Talmudic, pro-Shulchan Aruch forces within the community. Or rabbis who are influential in the community. I think his book is widely sold though within the community, and I think his approach has, struck a chord. And again, there are even non-Ethiopians who have come to respect him for his flexibility and his endorsement of peace and trying to have harmony within the community and respecting the ancient heritage of Ethiopia in a way that allows this community to integrate within the broader community of observant Jewry in a way that sort of overcomes that religious crisis of moving to Israel and discovering that Judaism means something totally different from what your community has been practicing for hundreds of years in a very dramatic way, right? They didn't have Hebrew. I didn't mention the Ethiopian community didn't preserve Hebrew. They didn't have the Torah even in Hebrew. Their Torah existed in a language called Gez, which was a non-spoken language, right? They spoke mostly Amharic or some other Ethiopian languages, like it's a spoken language, and their scripture was preserved in a more ancient language called Gez, which was not widely known. It was only the priests of the community, like the Kaisim, who preserved this language, and they were the ones who taught scripture. So even something as fundamental as the Torah in Hebrew, they didn't have, right? So they had in translation in Gez. So it's a very, very different community, but one that is, I think it's one of the most amazing achievements of Zionism that this community was brought to Israel, and I think it's, with all the challenges, it's been a success in many ways by many metrics, and please God will be increasingly successful. Coming up in a few days is the Ethiopian Jewish holiday of Sigid. They don't have Hanukkah or Purim. They do have Sigid, which is 50 days after Yom Kippur. They celebrate as a holiday, so it's coming up in not this week, but next week, right? I think it's November 10th. So if you look at Israeli newspapers or Israeli TV, or you'll see coverage of the Sigid celebrations, which has now become like a thing in Israel now. I think it's there are non-Ethiopians now who have tried to honor the day, and you'll see the prime minister, I'm sure, will do some Sigid commemoration, and the president of Israel will do something, and the chief rabbis, the Ashkenazi and Sephardi chief rabbi will honor the Sigid and will go to some ceremony there as well. So there is this meeting and this attempt at mutual respect, which I think is very positive. Okay, final questions before we pause. I don't want to keep you longer than you signed up for. Okay. If you think of questions later, please send emails or call. Thank you so much for signing on tonight, and I'm looking forward to other opportunities to learn with you all in the coming days and weeks. Take care, guys.